Started. My name is Frank Urena. I'm a principal architect with Oxford Computer Group, and joining me today is my colleague, esteemed colleague, Robb, who's one of our principal consultants. And we're going to be talking with you today on complex identity scenarios with Azure Active Directory. And we did put complex scenarios. There will be a lot of coverage on some of the more complex things you can do with Azure AD, especially around customer identity and access management, also known in Azure AD parlance as AD B2C. But we're also going to cover some kind of basics because we don't know exactly what the knowledge level is as far as Azure AD or in terms of this, identity as a service providers out there. So we'll go through that as well. So some quick intros in our agenda. We're going to just talk a little bit about OCG for those of you not familiar with what we do. We're going to talk about and kind of level set and what is Azure Active Directory, just to get everybody on the same page. And then we're going to talk about some of these identity scenarios. So Oxford Computer Group, been around for 16 plus years. Actually, the roots of the organization go back to the mid 80s as a training concern, mainly working with Microsoft on training programs for various solutions, particularly around what is now known as Microsoft Identity Manager, or MIM, which has had a very long life and is still going. But we also now, of course, are heavily invested in all the cloud technologies that Microsoft resells or produces and resells. And in that, we have a very deep implementation experience with Microsoft, but also with Savient, our identity governance partner, something that we have been working for the past few years in that space as well. So our focus is on identity-driven solutions. Helping customers identify, strategize around their roadmap, user lifecycle management, Active Directory remediation and consolidation, identity governance, as I mentioned before, identity data and security. Again, largely around the Microsoft stack with their security products, and also helping organizations with mergers and acquisition activity. So what that entails. We've been a national solution provider with Microsoft for, I guess, several years. Hundreds of PIM and MIM implementations, plus more recently, Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, Office 365 migrations as well. And let's get started here with a brief discussion around Azure AD versus AD. And I added this in here because even up until a couple months ago, I was speaking with a customer, and they were a potential customer, someone looking into an IDaaS solution, and they were still kind of under the impression, based on the conversation we had, that Azure AD was basically Active Directory in the cloud. So you just took Active Directory with all of its features and flaws and just kind of cloudified it. And that's not really the case. As we know, Active Directory, we know what that is. It's a service that runs on the Windows server. Kerberos is its primary authentication protocol, but also supports LDAP and NTLM for legacy. It manages your users, groups, computers, integrates lightweight directory services, certificate services, federation services, rights management services, plus a few other things. And it predates the cloud. It's actually as old as my oldest child, my son, who's 21 years old. So as you know, it's a little long in the tooth, but has a very, very wide distribution. Every single organization that I've ever worked with, and I've been doing consulting for about 15 years, has had an Active Directory domain in their environment. So it's not something that's going away anytime soon, and it's going to continue to provide identity, at least from an on-premise perspective. Azure Active Directory, really the only thing in common with Active Directory is the Active Directory label in the name. And I often say that when Microsoft was developing Azure Active Directory, I guess someone lacked a little imagination, or they didn't consult the marketing department on giving it a really cool name, like they've done with like Cosmos DB or even Azure. They could have called it something else like Cloud Directory, Universal Cloud Directory, anything like that. But they went with what they know. They just said Azure Active Directory. That was probably leads a little that confusion. But it is not simply Active Directory in the cloud. It is built from the ground up um, in Azure to handle the billions of uh, objects that and signals that it is processing on a daily basis in the billions. And I was trying to get updated numbers as to what it is now, but that number is constantly changing. But rest assured, the last one I saw was 10 billion users, 450 million organizations are using Azure AD for identity in one way, shape, or form. So it is quite a robust system that has been developed. So it is that cloud directory that provides a secure online authentication store. It enables single sign-on to thousands of third-party apps now. And we'll take a brief look during one of the demos of the gallery to see what that number is now. Of course, it can handle multi-factor authentication, has a self-service password reset functionality that can also provide that functionality back down to your on-premises in a hybrid configuration, which we'll talk about a little bit, and also provides risk-based conditional access to, again, provide the most secure experience for your users. Azure AD is also the identity and access management control plane for other Microsoft products like Microsoft 365, better known as Office 365, Dynamics 365, and also Azure Infrastructure as a Service. And unlike AD, which is using still legacy protocols for authentication and authorization, Azure AD is leveraging modern authentication protocols like OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0, but it also still has support for legacy federation protocols like SAML and WSFed. So some standard use cases around identity with Azure AD. So the first introduction many organizations have with Azure AD, and they don't even know it, is when they sign up for an Office 365 subscription. Perhaps they're a startup company just getting off the ground, and many startup companies today, of course, are not investing in on-premises infrastructure because there are so many robust, stable, secure cloud offerings out there. So they get their credit card out and they sign up for a subscription to Office 365. This could be, the M365 business subscription, basic subscription. Really doesn't matter. They just want email. Perhaps they're going to leverage Teams, and they want to be able to also use SharePoint and a couple other workloads. They sign up for that subscription. Well, behind the scenes, they're actually getting an Azure AD tenant. When they input the name of their company, so fabuloustoys.com is signing up for Office 365 subscription. They put the fabuloustoys.onmicrosoft.com. That name essentially becomes a tenant and is the security boundary in Azure AD that they're going to leverage. They may never go to the actual Azure portal. They may do everything within the Office 365 portal as far as administration, onboarding their users either one by one if they're a small company, or through a batch process using a CSV file if they have 30, 40, 50 or more users they want to get onboarded quickly. But behind the scenes, Azure AD is working. And now they're able to also tie in their third-party SaaS applications. They want to provide that single sign-on to their users. And so they may be leveraging Zoom for video conferencing. They may be leveraging a small CRM solution that supports a single sign-on, federated single sign-on. So now they can provide single sign-on for their users using Azure AD. And in the past, with a basic Azure AD subscription, you were limited to about 10 applications. Well, as of May 1st, Microsoft has made single sign-on available for free, regardless of what tier licensing you have for Azure AD, which is great because now any size organization can take advantage of that feature. when they're using Azure AD. That organization too is going to have the security defaults automatically enabled for them in their tenant. Those security defaults basically now are for any tenants that come online. I believe it was October of last year. The security defaults are being turned on, which means that any admins will automatically be enrolled and have to use MFA for any access. And any legacy protocols such as IMAP and POP and SMTP are going to be disabled by default, which again just enhances that security posture, and the customer doesn't even have to think about it. It's already been done. Now, of course, that is probably not your story. Don't know exactly who's joining us today, but of the 35 people currently in attendance, I could imagine that there are probably no startups who are operating this way. You're more likely in the second column here of a hybrid customer. You have a long-established on-premises infrastructure. Active Directory is your primary directory, your primary means of authenticating users on-prem. It's how you manage your computers and your groups. You have security policies in place through group policy objects that are providing that baseline security for your workstations, and of course, providing other settings in your environment. But you're either have made the move to the cloud, you're already an Office 365 customer, or about to start that journey. And so you want to get your on-premises users, your on-premises directory into Azure AD, and that has been available really since the start. We know the old method, if you've been using it for a while, was DirSync, then DirSync, and now it's more mature. Descendant Azure AD Connect actually shares a lot of similarities, a lot of DNA with the Microsoft Identity Manager product, but it's purpose-built. It's the tool that's used to synchronize Active Directory into Azure AD Connect, and provides for that seamless transition. Again, that this organization and this hybrid customer is also going to use third-party SaaS solutions and enable SSO for their users. And they may even have some legacy on-premise applications that they can leverage now the Azure App Proxy. The Azure App Proxy is an agent that runs on a Windows server, allows you to take any legacy applications that are HTTP enabled, have a web sign-in component, and be able to proxy those through Azure AD, so that now you can also take advantage of Azure AD's authentication abilities and capabilities to sign into those on-premises applications. Some examples that are usually the ones that are used is if you still have Exchange on premise, for instance, and you have OWA exposed through your firewall to allow users to log in via OWA for their email. Instead of running that through your proxy and opening up your firewall ports on port 443 to the Exchange Web Services service, you can now present that or have it just be an outbound connection to Azure AD and have OWA, your on-premises OWA, presented in or authenticated through Azure AD instead. And I just saw about an hour ago that even the remote desktop gateway is also now available through the Azure App Proxy as well. I don't have a lot of details, just so I've come across, but that's just another application, on-premise application that can be proxied through Azure App Proxy. And for those that don't want to use Azure App Proxy sitting on the Windows server, there are actually third-party providers like F5 and Zscaler that can also act as a proxy for Azure AD and allow you to host that application for authentication purposes through Azure AD as well. There is one more scenario here. I didn't have a bullet point, but I do want to not leave out, and that is now the ability to do Azure AD cloud provisioning. That's a new feature that, like Azure AD Connect, allows you to synchronize your on-premises users into the cloud without the larger footprint of Azure AD Connect. It's again agent-based. The main function for Azure AD Cloud Provisioning is to allow you to take disconnected forests and consume those or import those users, synchronize those users into your Azure AD tenant without having to establish any kind of connectivity from those disconnected forests to your Azure AD Connect server. So picture in a merger and acquisition kind of scenario where company A is buying company B. They want to, of course, have company B's users in their Azure AD tenant because they want them to start using their Exchange Online, their Teams, their SharePoint, and other third-party applications that they have single sign-on enabled for. But they don't want to have to establish VPN connectivity between the two organizations or any kind of hub and spoke connectivity to a central location. They just want to be able to synchronize those user objects. But Azure AD Cloud Provisioning allows you to do that. They just deploy a simple agent onto the other forest, configure it, and they can synchronize those users into the environment. The main limitations, and there is a you can provide a link at the end to the documentation on it. But essentially, the main limitations right now is it does not do any computer objects. So if you're leveraging like hybrid Azure AD join as an example, where you need to synchronize those computer objects from Active Directory into Azure AD Cloud Provisioning is unable to do that at this time. And there's also no current support for write-back functionality with the cloud provision. So those are two of the major limitations right now, but a lot of organizations are taking advantage of this, especially in cases where they really just want their users to be able to start collaborating within the organization, get their Exchange migrated into a single tenant, start using Teams, especially now with our remote work from home situation that we're on. So we'll talk about now, because everything that I have spoken of to this point really involves what's known as a business enterprise, B2E, right? So it's a single organization that has an Azure AD tenant. They've got their own users that are in their own namespace, and they just want them to be able to access the resources that they've made available. There is a new feature. It's new in name, but it's been around for a while. It's external identities. If you have Azure AD, and before I continue, I did have a poll question, if you don't mind. I'm going to pause here and just put this poll up. Just want to get a feel for our audience. And the question here is, are you currently using Azure AD as your primary IDaaS solution? So if you don't mind giving us a response there. Get to a good threshold here. So give it 5 more seconds. Okay, so a little bit over half are yes, 48% no. And so that being the case, one more poll question would be the last one for our webinar here. Are you using a third-party IDaaS solution? And if so, of these that are listed here, which? Okay, and give it 10 more seconds. We're only at 21% voted, so it's fine. In case you haven't had a chance yet. All right, we've got pretty much other is the answer there. All right, so I apologize for kind of breaking into the presentation. I should have done that earlier, but I wanted to get that in. So these scenarios are more in the advanced use cases. External identities. So Azure AD B2B, so business to business collaboration, has been a feature that's been around for about 2.5 years. What that does, it enables you as an Azure AD admin to invite guest users into your tenant. Those guest users, they could be from partner organizations that you're doing business with, and you want to be able to share a resource with them or an application. So it could be a financial reporting tool that you're sharing with this partner that's being hosted in your Azure AD tenant, or hosted. When I say hosted, I mean being the access is being controlled by Azure AD. It could be your own homegrown application that you built and you're sharing out with the partner. It could also be, again, in the mergers and acquisition scenario, it could be the acquired company that you're first inviting in as guests, because you're not fully synchronizing them, and they may have their own Azure AD tenant. They may already be, for instance, Office 365 customers with their own Azure AD tenant, but you're inviting them into your guest tenant to be able to start doing collaboration. And the only difference between a guest account and a full-fledged member account is really that annotation. You can convert guest accounts into member accounts into your tenant at the same time. But they've added some capabilities around this B2B functionality, and now they've grouped it under this entity known as external identities. And I'm going to demonstrate it in terms of just showing you where it is and what some of the options are there. But the ability to still invite guests via an email still supported. So if you use that feature in the past, you can send an email out to those users that you want to invite. They redeem that invitation, and if they already have their own Azure AD tenant as part of their organization, then identity and authentication is managed on their side. So you make a resource available for them to use when they want to log in. The authentication is occurring on their Azure AD tenant, not yours. So you don't have to manage that identity in your tenant. There's no passwords you have to worry about resetting. Everything is managed at the partner organization. Feature that was made available about a year ago that went into public preview is direct federation with partner organizations via SAML or WSFed. And those would be a case where the partner organization did not have any cloud presence. They didn't have Azure AD. They didn't even have any kind of Microsoft account, Microsoft consumer level accounts like Hotmail, Outlook.com, Live.com, which could also be used for this. And so they have just on-premise ADFS as an example. Well, now you can configure direct federation with those organizations as well, where you kind of onboard the organization into your tenant, and when you send out the invitations to them, they can redeem, go through that same redemption process and be given access to the resource you're making available. And there's also now the ability to add social identities like Google and Facebook. And we'll show an example of that on one of the Microsoft demo sites for that. So I'm going to show my screen for that. And let's see. All right, so everyone should see my Azure AD tenant here. So if you're familiar with this, if you're currently using it, this is what Azure AD looks like. It's available at portal.azure.com. And again, very basic, so that standard use case, onboarded some users, they all live here. These are all Office 365 users as well. Same thing for groups. So nothing special there. And if I had an Azure AD Connect synchronization server, then I could also see the status and the health of that Azure AD Connect box here. and get any alerts and analytics for my on-premises Azure AD, and I would see my users. Only difference being that instead of the source being Azure Active Directory, their source would say Windows Server Active Directory. But the new features here is this external identity. So that's what we were referring to. So previously, again, just known as B2B. And so for instance, if I wanted to create a new user, you notice here I have a create guest user account here. And I can do it through this invitation process. So for instance, if I was going to invite a user, and this is an actual user that I have here. Again, of course, I'm doing this as a one-off, but this invitation will go out to this user. And now if I look at my directory, I should see that new user added here, and it says the source is an invited user. And if I log in as that user and redeem that account or that invitation, I'll now be given guest access into this tenant. The way you can configure some of these flows and some of the invitation is, again, here through external identity. So we notice that for social identity providers, we now have the ability to add Facebook and Google. And you can have, even for your partner organizations, if you're familiar with Azure B2C, and Randy's going to get very detailed on Azure B2C, and you know that there's the ability to do very complex sign-in user flows where a user can sign up for access to your application. That ability is also now extended here on the B2B side. And this is the other feature here that's fairly new, and that is the ability to do direct federation with a partner. So if I wanted to do that, I can select which protocol I'm using, SAML and WSFed. I give the name of the organization here, and I was working on this earlier, and unfortunately I had a little problem with my on-premise ADFS environment, but essentially you would fill out this information for their endpoints, and you would, and they would do the same on their side. They would have to create a relying party trust, make some adjustments to the claims identifiers on their side, and this is all documented. The instructions are pretty good in the documentation on how to do that. But now you can start inviting users from this organization, and they would not need to sign up for a Microsoft account. That was the old experience where they would, if they didn't have any cloud presence, they didn't have Azure AD, they weren't Office 365 customers, they would have to sign up for a Microsoft account, and that a lot of customers did not want to have to do that. So now this direct federation allows you to directly federate, just as you might have done in the past if you had ADFS on-premise and you were doing federation with another organization that had ADFS on-premise. You can do that federation. You can now do that cloud to on-premise federation. And so an example of that, if we look at this side, this is a B2C demo site that Microsoft put together. So this is not something that Oxford put together, but it's a site that Microsoft put together. It's available at Woodgrove B2Cdemo.azurewebsites.net if you wanted to take a closer look. But essentially, you notice that there are 3 different flows, sign-up flows that users can take. Individual customers, business customers, and partners. And if I go to the business partners, this is where the external identities piece of it kicks in, right? So if I click on sign in with my supplier account and I click on sign in options, you notice here that I have sign in with Google and sign in with Facebook available as options. That was something that did not exist before, but that feature is now available in Azure AD within your own B2E tenant. This means that you don't have to establish a separate B2C tenant just to take advantage of these features, and you can manage your partner accounts within your main Azure AD tenant. Now with that, I'm going to transition. We're going to transition. I'm going to turn over the console here to Randy. Let me get our PowerPoint presentation back up. Give him access. Randy, are you good?
Yep, I think so. Hello,
Okay.
everybody. Hey, I'm going to talk about the what Frank has just covered is pretty much a lot of the identities and how you can interact with identities within Azure. And he's done a good job of showing the um, traditional tenant uh, identity security plane where you have a single tenant and you have the ability to control access to your applications that belong to your tenant, to your business tenant, and how you can integrate with all kinds of identities. You can integrate with your on-premises identities. You can integrate with now with social identities, Facebook and Google. Those are the only two options for that. But you also can invite other external users, and you can federate with users. And so let me click on to the next slide if it comes up here. Basically, what you're seeing there is the single tenant application, and it's the security plane is that single tenant, which is your Azure business tenant. And of course, within that, you have B2B users that can be created and utilize your software as a service applications. It can utilize those identities for custom applications that you create. And the security plane is really that company tenant. And when you create those applications or register those applications, it's using that tenant as a security plane. Within the Azure environment, if you look at what the different types of applications you can create are, you also have a choice of a multi-tenant, and that's kind of misleading. They're kind of grouping all these things together. Really, when you create a multi-tenant application, it is being registered in your tenant, but it's being exposed universally to the whole Azure environment. So it's actually an application that's registered at the common endpoint. And once you do that, users can access other Azure AD tenants. Users within those other Azure AD tenants can go to that application. And what happens is that it becomes automatically registered, that application, because it's at the common endpoint. It becomes automatically registered in that tenant of the user that's trying to access that application. Of course, that can be turned off by admins of those other Azure AD tenants. But basically, that's what that is. It's basically a way that you can develop an application and allow access to it to any other Azure tenant. And there's another way that you can create Azure applications, and that's utilizing Azure B2C. And B2C is basically a modern identity provider. It utilizes OpenID and OAuth as its security plane, and it's completely customizable. The only issue with B2C is that, like, if you have your Azure business tenant, like wingtiptoys.com, you can't just add B2C capability to that. You have to actually have its own dedicated AD tenant for that B2C environment. And the reasons for that is because there's an actual additional plane that's created, a security plane that's focused on that B2C environment that um, as you'll see later on, you can create these custom profiles for that environment. And that those custom profiles that you create are part of the OpenID Connect /OAuth endpoint that you can manipulate and change and basically do whatever you want to do with that. And that uses a different endpoint than the normal Azure AD tenant. And they can handle millions and millions of users just like Azure AD can, but the difference is that you're not charged per user license. It's per authentication, and it's a relatively low cost. And I believe it's the first 50,000 users are free. So it's basically intended for consumer-facing applications. That's what it was originally created for. But you can integrate partners' identities with that as well. And let me go to the next slide. And when I work with clients with B2C, they have these ideas of what B2C can be used for, because they think it's like an extension of their Azure tenant, and it really isn't. It's its own dedicated tenant. And one of the things that you can't do, like with a normal Azure AD tenant, you can have SaaS applications. You can go to the marketplace and get, Workday or whatever, and you can actually dedicate those to your Azure AD tenant and those users within that tenant. You can't do that with B2C. You can't utilize any of your Office 365 applications. You can't get an Office 365 subscription for your Azure AD B2C tenant. It just doesn't work. You can't do that. The other thing is that there are really two types of users within a B2C tenant, and they are the B2C user objects that represent consumers of the applications that you register as B2C applications. And then there are also Azure AD tenant users that are similar to normal Azure AD tenant users. While these local B2C user accounts or these user objects can't be used as external B2B accounts, they can't be represented as external B2B accounts in other Azure tenants. Now, some of the ones can be if they're in the Azure AD tenant base, but in general, we just tell people, hey, they can't be. They're not their own identities. The purpose for this is really for federation of identities for some type of consumer or partner application, and it just doesn't behave the same way. The other thing with these special B2C user accounts, they can't be assigned Azure AD roles. And I'll show you later on when I show you the actual Azure B2C interface, what accounts can be assigned roles. But in general, B2C user accounts, if they're dedicated accounts for those applications, they typically can't be assigned Azure AD roles. And the other thing that clients think that they can do with B2C is provide some type of authentication proxy. I had a client that wanted, they basically, their identity provider that they were using a modern identity provider, but they had some backend interfaces to LDAP, and it actually mediated the LDAP authentication with their modern authentication, authorization and authentication, so that there was like a link between those, a strong link. And Azure AD B2C can't do that. It can integrate with other identity providers using OAuth, OpenID Connect, SAML, but it doesn't mediate that identity authorization and authentication with anything else other than those three types of providers. Now, you could create some type of API that would verify passwords via LDAP or even get information from LDAP, but there's not a glue that ties those two authentication mechanisms in place. Let me go back here. One of the really neat things about Azure AD B2C is that it's really completely customizable. You can have your client application look the way you want it to look, and your logon screens can be customized to match whatever you have on your customer application. So it can be seamless. It can look, you don't have to have this jarring difference between the login screens versus your client application. They can integrate and be pretty much seamless. And it's really a lot more than just an identity store that does authentication and authorization. And the reason that is because it extends your normal OAuth OpenID Connect interface by adding an additional profile to the OAuth endpoint. Now, what you do when you make these calls to the OpenID Connect OAuth endpoint, you give it this additional parameter called the relying party policy. And that policy is ingested and basically modifies your authorization server so that it can the authorization server will do what you want it to do. Now, in a normal Azure AD environment, except in the case where you're dealing with those other external identities like Google and Facebook. There is a limited feature that does this, but in general, you are locked to the login.microsoft.com OAuth endpoint, and you can't modify that. That's controlled by Microsoft. You're either redirected to the login screen or ingest your tokens. That is all part of the infrastructure, the Microsoft infrastructure. But with B2C, because you have this other endpoint that you're dealing with, you can completely customize that. You can give back any tokens that you want. You can connect to any API that you want to generate those tokens. It's a really neat feature. And you can do all kinds of things once you open that up, because now instead of writing some type of custom authentication and authorization application that mediates that for you, you can just use standard protocol, standard files called custom profiles to arrange that user journey for you. Like I said, again, it's completely customizable. And Azure AD B2C, like I said, it uses a policy-based model for integration with the authorization server. That means that you can have your applications be dedicated to one or several types of sign-up policies. Each application can have its own sign-up or profile editing policy. Basically, it can be customized so that each application gets its own set of tokens back, depending on what that application is. Not only can it do that on a per application basis, but it can do that on a per user basis as well. I think right here, you can have custom profiles based on where those users are from, how old they are, what countries they come from. You can lock down age groups. You can completely customize the whole thing based on the user that's signing in. And it integrates with any identity provider, to any modern identity provider you can trust. So if you want to use Google, Facebook, Twitter, any of those, even your own custom identity providers that you have, maybe you're using Identity Server as one of your identity stores, it can trust that too. One of the really neat things that you can do too is that not only can you use any identity provider, trust any modern identity provider for your applications, but you can do some type of back-end searching. Let's say that you have dynamic CRM on the back end and you have these users in your customer relationship database somewhere, where you can what you can do based on that user, you can use an API interface to talk to that back end, get claims based on those users and return those as tokens in your application, so you can customize your applications based on those tokens that are returned. And also, because you have complete control over that, you can have separate progressive profiles. You can have people add additional information based on who they are, based on where they're coming from. It's super good in the way that it works. As part of this too, like I said, you can integrate with like dynamic CRM or really any type of backend system to do verification. If you had your own security API where you were doing some type of evaluation on the user to see who they were, whether they're a risky sign-in or not, you can actually use those proofing tools to let the person in or not. And then you have your user insights that are available via the B2C interface that lets you know where the logins are, their sign up, sign in, conversion rates, what devices are, where they're coming from. And then what you can do if you want to, you can even use this data once it's analyzed to then control your profile progression, or your if you want to get additional information from users that are in other countries, you can do that and then there are also different regions laws are determined. The different regions have different laws, different countries have different laws. You can even set up different policies based on those regions. I'm sorry, I have to close my door. Hang on just a second. Okay, another feature, because these policies are completely customizable, it enables you to either do a pre-migration where you can get the users from your current application security mechanism. You can populate them ahead of time, and you can migrate them without a password, and then you can use password harvesting to do that before you go live, or you can actually customize the policies so that you can do a migration after go live. So basically you validate, you can have an API that talks to your old system, validates the password, and if it is correct, it can publish the password in the new system. And then from then on, the person would be logging in with your Azure B2C security plane rather than utilizing their old password. And then once you do that, they're capable of changing their own password within the B2C environment. What I have here is just an overview of the B2C environment, and with custom policies. It looks kind of busy, but I like to show this to my clients so that I can show them where everything is, and it would make more sense if I was actually working with you as a client. I would have my Azure B2C environment up so that I can show you these things. But if you look at this area here, in the center, Azure AD, that's a B2C base. This is your Azure tenant that you create. And within that, you create some custom applications, the identity framework policy, and these are really where all your users live. And if you want to create applications that can manage those users from an administrative point of view, like reset their passwords or delete, add users manually, this is the environment that you would do that in. And this would take the standard OAuth type protocols. Now, since Azure AD B2C environment is an OpenID Connect, you do get access tokens, not access tokens, but ID tokens from this environment. And you can't do things like client credentials to interact with your environment. That would have to be done over here in your Azure AD environment. But as part of your Azure AD B2C environment, you have places where you can keep your token certificates, user IDs and secrets for your APIs. And this is where you create your base policies, your relying party policies, and your extension policies. This whole environment here works together. And these are colored blue because blue is what you would basically configure in your environment. The things that are in orange are things that you would make completely from scratch. Basically, that's what you would create or you would provide. Here, like I said, the user interface is completely customizable. That's where you'd customize it at right here at this point. So what you would do is you'd have an application that you want to secure with Azure AD B2C, and you'd point it to your authorization endpoint, which would have that relying party file as part of the policy. And then whatever user journeys that you have configured in this environment, that's what it would do. It'd either call back these APIs, it would call external identity providers, or it would call its own if it was a local account, or you could federate that with other external identity providers that utilize modern authentication. And the interface here is the way that you actually log in, and then you can do other things where you can write JavaScript to look at that information. You can even talk to backend APIs at this level and manage that experience. And then once that whole process is done, you get back a set of ID tokens and or access tokens that you can use for your application to provide that security. And I think the next slide is my demo. Yes. So Frank, if you want to give me control so that I can show my demo, I want to show you a B2C tenant and how easy it is to just get started.
Okay, Randy, you should have done it right.
Yep. Well, that's not good. Let's see, I wanted to pick my monitor. Oh, it was there. Okay, good. So now you can see my Azure AD B2C tenant here. Is it? Yes?
Yep, it's
Okay,
up.
good. Okay, good. So what I want to show you here is to get started. Basically what you'd do is you would create a new Azure AD B2C tenant with your Azure subscription. And this is what you'd get. And if you see here, you have your Azure Active Directory environment, but this is the Azure AD B2C blade. Basically, I want to show you how easy it is to get integrated with this without having to do these custom policies and get really complicated, because there is an easy way to do this. The first thing I'm going to do, because all modern authentication mechanisms need to have their applications registered, I need to create a new application. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a new application here. And I'm going to select accounts in any organizational directory or identity provider, that's B2C. And I'm going to put here on a site that Microsoft uses or makes available, which is the token endpoint, that this can consume token endpoints and show you what's in those tokens. So I'm just going to register this. And once that's registered, I just need to do one more thing here, and I'm going to make sure that it allows implicit flow. The reason I have to do that is because the jwt.ms site requires that there's no way to actually make a second call to get the ID token or the access token. Save this. And now what I want to do is go here and go to my user flows, and I'm just going to create one of these based on the wizards that's there. New user flow. I'm going to just use one of these V2 user flows. You get more, it's a different type of authorization endpoint. And I'm just going to call this a test app. And because I haven't registered any external identity providers in this is a pretty fresh tenant, I'm just going to select email sign up, which is my local Azure AD environment. And I'm going to get, I'm going to collect and return my given name, the surname, and I also like to do display name. And you can extend these attributes so that you can add custom attributes if you want to. I'm going to create that. Now I have my user flow. Now at this point, I've created my user flow. I've defined my my attributes. I've defined the identity provider, which is a local identity provider. So now, since I've done this, I can run this. And right now, it is available to use your app. If your app wanted to ingest these tokens, you would put your app as a reply URL, and you could use this. Now I'm going to run the user flow, and right away, I have the ability to log in or sign up. I actually have this account here right now. So as you can see, I can sign in, and jwt.ms should show me my tokens that I've got back, and it does. So there you have it. That's how easy it is to get started with this, to integrate this with your applications. So with that, I'm done, and any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
All right, so I'm actually answering some of the questions that we received online. Just want to make sure we're going to have enough time for that. So one of the questions was, what is the difference between setting up the direct federation and ADFS federation with a partner? Does a direct federation, is it any different from adding a SaaS application to your Azure AD using SAML? So the first part of that is the direct federation is essentially allowing you to, from your Azure AD, almost treating it like it had an ADFS type component on it, and you're federating with an organization that is still using ADFS, or it could be any other on-premise IDP solution. They may have Ping ID, for instance, right? That's doing that, or even some homegrown type of IDP. And as long as you're able to exchange that metadata and reach their STS, their secure token services, you're able to directly federate them. And that what that allows you to do is now when the user from that organization, so let's say you're federating with Fabricam.com, you set up Fabricam.com in your Azure AD tenant as a direct federation, and you're going to be pointing to their ADFS as their identity provider, so that when they want to access your resource, they are authenticating against their own on-prem ADFS.
Right, and basically what happens during direct federation, the authentication happens with that entity you're directly federating with.
Right. And yes, it is different from adding a SaaS application, because with a SaaS application, you're setting up a relying party trust essentially with another organization that may have registered their application within Azure AD, or more often than not, if it's SAML, then they're just providing endpoints like their assertion consumer service, particularly to consume those claims that you're sending from your Azure AD tenant to them as the service provider. So they're the service provider. Azure AD is your IDP. And when a user wants to log in, let's say to Concur or to Salesforce or ServiceNow, ServiceNow has an endpoint that is going to be able to consume that claim that says, yep, this is the user. They logged in to their IDP and they have a token, and we're able to consume that token and accept that as a legitimate authentication.
Yep, that application is trusting Azure AD for its identity.
Another question here was, does Azure AD B2B provide Azure AD Premium license to guest users automatically for MFA? So with Azure AD B2B, the license model there has always been a 5-to-1 ratio. So for every one user that you have licensed in your tenant, let's say you have Azure AD Active Directory Premium, one of the premium plans, either P1 or P2, you can have 5 guest users in the environment. So 100 licensed users could be up to 500 guest users. And yes, you can MFA all of those guest accounts as well. MFA in general is now generally free for any Azure AD customer. You don't have to have a premium plan. That's true for SSO, and it's true for MFA. So yes, you can do that. There was a question regarding conditional access policies. So we weren't touching on conditional access policies. That's more of a security configuration setting, but please feel free to reach out to us if you do have questions regarding conditional access. The video, yes, this video, we usually post a video up on our YouTube channel, so we will make that available. You should be getting a follow-up email to your registered email address where you can see that. Question here, in Azure AD B2B, can we have continuous sync of user and their attributes? Example, user created, updated, deleted, AD should be synced to AD2. No, because B2B, again, is really about inviting guest users, guest accounts into your Azure AD 10. There really is no synchronization, because essentially it becomes a mechanism for that guest account that really lives, their identity really lives in some other tenant. It lives either in an Azure AD tenant, or as we discussed before, if you're using direct federation, it could live in an on-prem environment like Active Directory that's being front-ended by Active Directory Federation services. So the account in your tenant is really there just to be able to accept that claim, because now your Azure AD tenant kind of becomes a service provider. You're providing a service. You're sharing a resource, let's say an application, with that partner, and now you become the service provider. So their IDP is sending claims to your Azure AD tenant saying that they've authenticated and they are who they say they are, and now you're accepting that. There really is no synchronization with like an on-prem Active Directory. Okay, there was another question, and then I asked for a follow-up. So let me ask the question. And the question was, if a user has multiple accounts that are part of a federation with our tenant, is it possible to link together those as the same user? And so I asked, how is that they have multiple?
Well, it is possible within B2C to do that.
Okay. And so, I mean, the clarifying was they have a university, the University of Higher Ed setting. They have a guest center for parents to access some things on behalf of the student, but they may only access it once or twice a year. They log in with their Facebook account, but next year they forgot to use their Google account. Oh, okay, I see. So Randy, maybe this is more like on the B2C side. So in that scenario, and we'll make it generic. Any case where you have a customer-facing or consumer-facing application, the user logged in one year with their Facebook social identity. The next year they forgot that they did that and they signed up with their Google. So now you have multiple identities for the same person with on different social platforms. Is there a way to
Yes,
synchronize?
so there's the attribute, it's called, I think it's the Identities attribute. But yeah, it's basically it shows all the associated identities. So you could have a Google, Facebook, local account, all of those together could represent the same individual, and they'd be able to authenticate with any of those accounts.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so we're a little bit over. We do appreciate everyone taking the time out to join us today for this session. So just keep an eye on this space, and if you signed up for our webinars in the past, you'll certainly be getting invites to future webinars. We do have one coming up in August regarding passwordless journey. So if that's an interest of you, please join us for that. And if there are no other questions, we will sign off now. We hope to see everyone soon.
Yeah, thanks everybody.